All right, we're going to get started. Let's have a word of prayer, and then we'll get rolling here this morning, okay? Thank you again, Lord, for the opportunity to be here. I pray for your mercy and help to us as we consider some important things that help us to understand the Bible better. And I do pray that that would be the end result, a better understanding of your word, so that we can not only be hearers but doers of what it says. And we'll thank you in Christ's name. Amen. So the notes that are in front of you start with what I just prayed, and I just want to make sure that we are reminded of that every week, that while really I am just going to give you information here this morning and try to put some things in context, that is not the end goal. It should never be. I think it might be a proneness that maybe especially a church like ours that loves Bible doctrine, we love teaching, but it's possible for us to morph into a deception that growing in knowledge is the same thing as growing in Christ. Or that, say it the opposite way, spiritual growth equals intellectual growth. And certainly that is a component. The Bible clearly and consistently talks about the importance of truth. We need to know truth. Truth sets us free. But that is not the end all. And so this kind of study, again, while we think it's important or we wouldn't do it, also has that danger that we could slip into if we're not careful. So we've spent 3 weeks in the Old Testament just trying to contextualize that geographically, historically, theologically. And I'm going to spend today on the intertestamental period and try to, maybe this will raise questions, maybe I obviously hope that it'll be helpful, but I want to talk about what happens between the Testaments, because if you've, there's a pretty big difference how the Old Testament closes and how the New Testament opens. You ever notice that? Like when you're reading your Old Testament, if you just read the chronology, and we talked about really it ends in Ezra, Nehemiah, Malachi, those passages, and you see what's happening there historically, and then all of a sudden you jump into the Roman Empire and the Gospels in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, right? And there's a lot of stuff that if you don't know anything about the intertestament, the intertestamental period, you're just like, well, where did these guys come from? Okay, for example, there are no Pharisees when the Old Testament closes, right? Where'd they come from? How did they develop? There are no scribes when the Old Testament closes. So the intertestamental history, I think, is helpful. It's sometimes called the 400 silent years. Are you familiar with that phrase at all? It's pretty self-explanatory. I don't think I need to tell. 400 silent years wherein there are, so far as we know, no prophets, no new revelation, no books of the Bible written for about 400 years. It's the period of time that Amos prophesied. You remember when Amos talked about there's going to come a famine not of bread or water, but a famine of the Word. Like God is going to be silent. And folks, that is one of those severe judgments that God could put on His people. And that's indeed what happened. 400 silent years, no prophets, no new revelation, no books of the Bible written according in fulfillment of Amos chapter 8. So what happens during this time, and where do some of the things that are just kind of assumed, they're just there when you start in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, how did they develop? It might be helpful. Do you remember in the book of Daniel when Nebuchadnezzar has the dream about the vision of that statue? It might be helpful just to set the intertestamental history in that context. You remember that statue, that image had a gold head, right? It had a silver torso, chest, and arms. It had bronze waist and then iron legs. You remember that? And then the feet. I'm not going to get to the feet. We still don't know what the feet are. Remember the clay and iron mixed. Whenever you get to, unless the Bible interprets prophecy for you, it's always dangerous to say we know exactly what that is. The 10 toes, and which are also the 10 horns, people thought for years. Remember that was, well, some of you don't remember, you're too young. But for forever, I grew up with any teaching on prophecy that had to be the European common market, which is not even a thing anymore. The prophecy teachers were waiting. Oh, there's 8 members of the European common market, and when there gets to be 10, then the rapture is going to happen, because that's the 10 toes of the image and the 10 horns, and so everybody's waiting for 10. Well, guess what? It went from 8 to 9 to 11. We're like, we messed up the image. It didn't have 11 toes, and then it kept going, and now we got the EU, and it's completely different. So we missed it on that one, right? So when you talk about end times, there's a danger associated with that. But we're not talking about the end times. We're talking about the intertestamental period, and I think we're pretty safe in understanding that Nebuchadnezzar's vision and Daniel's interpretation of that vision in light of at least those first 4 pieces in light of intertestamental period. So, and we know this much straight out of Scripture. The golden head represented what? Do you remember? Babylon. And Nebuchadnezzar in particular, right? And so your first blank there, letter A in your notes, Babylon deported the southern kingdom of Judah in 606 BC. Well, I know we already talked about that. That actually happens, that's recorded in the history, in the chronology of the Old Testament. But I want to start there just to see the progression. Babylon, world power. You remember Saddam Hussein? He superimposed his image over Nebuchadnezzar's because he wanted to restart the Babylonian Empire. That was his goal. Obviously, he didn't get Bible prophecy right either because he's dead. So anyway, that's modern-day Iraq is Babylon, and the Babylonian Empire, basically Nebuchadnezzar reigned over the entire known world. And so under that, I've got 4 blanks. What developed after the deportation of the Jews from the Promised Land, from the land of Palestine? 4 things that are significant in their exile. Number 1, and I know they're not numbered here, but the first blank, synagogues. Synagogues developed. Again, you don't read about them in your Old Testament, but when the Jews lost access, well, the temple was destroyed, but they also lost the ability to go back to Jerusalem. And so since they couldn't worship at Jerusalem in the temple, they developed synagogues. This is when it happened, and this is really the precursor even today for Orthodox Judaism. The development of synagogues and the worship that was decentralized from the Promised Land after they were deported and dispersed during the time of the Babylonian Empire. Synagogues are starting to develop under the Babylonian Empire. Second line there, the scribes. And I already kind of primed the pump for that one. Scribes were priests that lost their job. What is a priest to do if he can't minister in the temple? He's not at home. And so since they couldn't minister, they didn't have a temple. Again, it was destroyed. But what's a priest to do? Well, they became scholars. And their main job was to copy the Scriptures so that more Jews would have access to the Old Testament. And so the scribes were very fastidious in that. But they became scholars, they became writers, they became copiers of the Scriptures. Thirdly, and maybe I should have put this, scattered Jews. Why are there Jews everywhere today? Well, this harkens back to Babylonian deportation and why there are Jews all over the world with their synagogues. It's in the New Testament sometimes called the dispersion, okay? But it started during this deportation. And again, I know we talked about there were return trips, but not nearly all of the Jews who were exiled returned to the land. And they maintained their identity all over the world. The final blank under Babylon, under letter A, is strict monotheism. You probably remember as you read your Old Testament and you see the prophets and you see God's message of judgment, that one of the biggest problems in Israel, in both kingdoms, all the tribes, was the sin of idolatry. You remember that? The prophets are always talking about that. You remember even under the godly kings, one of the things that you'll often read, you'll see, well, he followed the Lord all the days of his life. However, the high places were not removed. Remember seeing statements like that? Well, that's because there were always pockets of idolatry, even when there was faithfulness. But the judgment of God in the Babylonian conquest seemed to finally take hold of the hearts of Jews, and they became devoutly committed to monotheism. Passages like Deuteronomy 6, which is still, in Orthodox Judaism, "Hear, O Israel, hear the Lord our God, the Lord is one." That became just entrenched in their identity, which is significant for a number of reasons, but not the least of them is that that's why when Jesus claimed to be God, they were so incensed. They just, because of their monotheism, they had no place for Trinity. They just couldn't understand. They just didn't have room for it. They didn't have a category for that. And so they hated Jesus precisely because, hey, don't you realize that what you're claiming is exactly what got us judged? It's the reason does that make sense? I had the chance to be in Germany when we had missionaries there, and the Germans, because of Hitler and Nazism and World War II, the Germans detest any kind of bigotry. They just detest it. They are open-minded really to a fault because they're I think still trying to do penance for the horrors of Nazi Germany. But they detest any kind of prejudice or discrimination at all. And we maybe come closer to understanding that because that's closer in time. Well, that's what I'm saying. That's what I'm trying to describe as a parallel to the Jewish mindset regarding idolatry. There's only one God. And our failure to recognize that is what got us into a world of hurt. Okay, so that's Babylon. Now, again, we're still in the Old Testament era. We're really not into the 400 silent years, but that's setting up what comes, and so I wanted to include that just in today's lesson. Any questions on Babylon or any follow-ups on any of those things I've mentioned? Yeah. Bigotry is hating somebody for anything. It's a kind of hatred. Often we associate it with race, being prejudice. But yeah, hating somebody because Nazis hated anybody that wasn't white. Yeah. Yeah, there were the 3 return trips that we talked about with the Old Testament, right? So Zerubbabel led a group, Ezra led a group, Nehemiah led a group, but Ezra will, I think both Ezra and Nehemiah actually, maybe even Zerubbabel in the book of Ezra, may tell you how many. It wouldn't have even been a majority. And we don't know how many didn't come back because they were dispersed. But yeah, there were the 3 return trips, and enough to repopulate Jerusalem, but not enough, not near all. And I wish I had harder numbers, but yeah. Came back from what? Yeah, actually, you're right. And I got ahead of myself. All of the return trips were under the Medo-Persian Empire. You're right. Yeah, I misspoke. So, yeah, Daniel notwithstanding, I mean, Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego, they rose to positions of prominence. But by and large, well, do you remember Nebuchadnezzar's son, Belshazzar, the writing on the wall? You know, remember where that came from? That was right before he was conquered. The Babylonians were conquered by the Persians, Cyrus, and that party. I mean, remember he actually pulled out all of the temple hardware and gold and all that stuff, and so that was part of the reason for that swift judgment under him. So, yeah, their policy towards Jews, well, towards any of their conquered peoples, was not one of tolerance. It wasn't until Persia that policy changed. Yeah, thank you for letting me clarify that. I didn't. I misspoke on that. Okay. Well, so letter B then is the Medo-Persian Empire. The silver arms, which some Bible teachers would even suggest the fact that there are two arms kind of lends toward the two branches of the empire. Medo-Persian Empire. Persia is modern-day Iran. So we're kind of on the map. We're kind of heading to the east. You had Iraq, modern-day Iraq, Babylon, and then Medo-Persian would be further to the east, modern-day Iran. But they overran the Babylonian Empire, and so letter B, the Medo-Persian Empire conquered the Babylonians about 70 years later, and they were a world power for about 200 years. Cyrus was the conquering hero for them. I don't have a blank for that, but he's where it starts. Under their reign, the Jews were allowed to return to Jerusalem, rebuild the temple and the city wall. So Nehemiah is in the court in the Medo-Persian Empire, not Babylon. And so again, we're coming to the end of the Old Testament, but we are into the 400 silent years now, because they were in power about 200 years. I'm rounding off. These are really rough numbers, but just for our purposes, I think they do the trick. Okay, and so this is the time of restoration, of tolerance towards the Jews. Any questions on that before we go on? Okay. By the way, the other vision in Daniel, you remember you had the goat with the one prominent horn, and then you had the ram. Well, first you had the ram with one horn. The Persians were a little more powerful than the Medes. But you had the ram, and then you had this goat coming furiously with one prominent horn. Remember this? It's weird stuff, right? Well, anyway, that's the vision, and the goat kills the ram. Who's the goat? Okay, Alexander the Great, I think, I heard. We're talking about Greece now. Okay, in fact, if you know the vision, the one big horn is broken off. Alexander, he gets depressed. He weeps. I've conquered the world. There's nothing left to conquer. Died very young. One horn breaks off, and there are four little horns that come up in its place because there were four generals that kind of split up the Grecian Empire. Okay, so but point here, letter C, which now we're into the bronze. Okay, at the waist. Greece had control of Palestine for about 150 years. And again, this would include not just I have space in Alexander's dad, Philip, his dad, and then Alexander, and then the generals, and then what followed from that. But Greece had control of Palestine for about 150 years. Now I've got 3 blanks under that. Why is it significant that the Greeks were basically rulers of the world for this period? 3 reasons. First blank, language. This now starts to make sense. Why was the New Testament written primarily in Greek? Because when the Greeks conquered the whole known world essentially at that time, then the whole world began speaking Greek. which also kind of sets up world evangelism. Everybody could speak Greek. And so when missionaries went, they could communicate, and it's the language of the New Testament. Greek is a very precise language. Hebrew, and I'm not a scholar in either, Hebrew is a more picturesque language. It's really suited well for storytelling, which most of your Old Testament is. It's good for poetry as well, but it's a more picturesque language. Greek is a very precise language. So really good when you get into the Pauline doctrinal passages. It's a very, very precise language. So Greek, in God's providence, Greece reigned because of language. Again, not that I'm pretending to know the mind of God behind all this, but I think that makes sense. Secondly, this is when the Sanhedrin came into being. And we talked about the Sanhedrin even in connection with the crucifixion of Christ. Remember, Joseph of Arimathea was a member of the council. That is no doubt a reference to the Sanhedrin. It was Sanhedrin was composed of 70 Jewish men, essentially the Supreme Court of the land. I mean, all questions about law goes to the Sanhedrin. So if you see that in writings of the New Testament or about the New Testament, that's when it was developed. And then thirdly, under letter C, this is a time of intense patriotism, or what today is called nationalism. And, not obviously nationalism could become a sinful kind of idolatry, but it's not necessarily sinful. But for the Jews, especially, they were conquered, but especially during the times of the generals, and I'm not going to get into all that, all of that, but the land of, the Jews had a time of independence after this. That's going to come next in letter D. But, like the Maccabees, anybody know that phrase? The Maccabees, that's one of the apocryphal books, which covers intertestamental history. It's not sinful to read the Maccabees. Okay, just recognize it's not inspired. It's not. In fact, even the Roman Catholic Church didn't include it as part of the canon of the Bible until after the Reformation. And you're talking about over 1,500 years. It was not considered by any Christian part of the Bible. But the Maccabees were the revolutionaries. They were the George Washingtons and the Nathan Hales and the Patrick Henrys of the Jewish homeland. Mattathias was one of those priests, and they fought for their independence and for a while gained it before the Roman Empire. But that's the Maccabees. And so this is a time of patriotism being stirred, especially at the end, leading into their independence. And so that's why. I'll get to this. I'll get to this next. This is connected to what follows. Letter D. The Jews enjoyed independence for about 100 years. Again, these are very round numbers. I'm not trying to be precise here. I'm just trying to kind of get us to 400 so you see where it fits, all right? But about 100 years, because of the revolt, because of Mattathias and the Maccabees, the Jews enjoy independence in their land for about 100 years. And again, I've got 3 blanks under that to highlight kind of what's going on culturally to set up the New Testament. The first blank is for hope. And maybe particularly you could say messianic hope. Because there's a great deal of patriotism, a great deal of nationalism, this is when they start thinking really in a focused way about a Messiah who would be a political deliverer. We need somebody else like Mattathias to come along. It would not be altogether unlike people today who would love for some kind of political leader to come along in our country. Maybe you hear somebody say, man, we need another Ronald Reagan, or we need, whoever their hero is. And so that's kind of what's happening in the land of Israel at this point. Does that make sense? It's a time of hope. It's a time of looking for a Messiah, for a political and military deliverer. Now, here's a word you may not know, you certainly don't use every day, but it's the second blank, because I am obsessed with alliteration, is for Hasidim. I'll spell it. And this is what they were actually called. I didn't make this word up. H-A-S-I-D-I-M. The Hasidim. H-A-S-I-D-I-M. It sounds kind of like Hasidic. Are you familiar with Hasidic Jews today? They're the ones that, if you didn't know any better, you might think they're Amish. Okay, they're the really super conservative Jews today. Got the men, they got the beards and the hats, and so maybe look. I don't know if you think they look like Amish. I do, but anyway, that's Hasidic Jews. That's the word. That's Hasidim. That's Hasidic. Okay, but this was a group that kind of came into being during this time of independence. They are the precursors of the Pharisees. So the Pharisees were originally known as the Hasidim. They're very conservative. They like a parallel in Christianity. These would be like fundamentalists. Fundamentalist Jews, not fundamentalist Christians, but they're fundamentalists. And because of that, you kind of could imagine this, they resist any foreign cultural influence at all. Right? Like the Amish. Okay, we don't want to be corrupted by the world, and so we're going to be different in any and every sense we can imagine. And so the Pharisees, that you can see how that set the stage for a kind of legalism, right? We're going to hold fast to all the law, and that's where it developed during this time of independence. And then the last blank under letter D is for Hellenizers. And again, not my word, but these were the people who tried to kind of convert to the Greek culture. This would be like the polar opposite of the Hasidim or the conservatives that want to resist culture. We instead, in fact, you can read this in the book of Acts. It has to do with Greek. In the, I think it's Latin. There's a linguistic connection anyway, but we want to be conformed to the culture. We want to become Hellenistic Jews. The whole problem. You remember in Acts 6 when there were some widows that were being fed and some who weren't. The ones who weren't, they were all Jews, but some were Hellenistic Jews. They were Greek-speaking Jews. And so that was even a division. I mean, you could all be Jews, but not the same Jews. Well, so this would have been a problem whether you were more Hasidic or whether you're more Hellenistic. Whether you wanted to resist foreign culture, we're going to speak Hebrew or Aramaic. No, we're going to speak Greek. Obviously, that would partly have to do with where you lived, but that's the Hellenizers. These were the precursors to the Sadducees. And that was kind of the temperament of the Sadducees, was we want to compromise our culture, our beliefs. We want to go along to get along. And so became more liberal. Okay? Now, well, let me take another breath. Any questions? Just making sense? You missed anything so far? Or? Okay. So letter E, we're to the iron legs. What's the iron legs? Generally conceded. Rome. Okay, Rome gained control of the land and ruled roughly the last 50 years of those intertestamental years. Rome gained control of the land. Okay? So finally, I guess I could have said that with Greece. You went from Babylon east, Persia, then the focus, the world, if you remember my original map, focus came back over here to Greece. Now we're European in world dominance, and then eventually to Rome. Okay? And so we went east and then back to the west ultimately. All right? And three things under the Roman Empire that became significant. These are not alliterated. The first blank is Herodians. You'll read about the Herodians when you get into your New Testament. That's not a big leap. What do you think? Who do you think they had to do with? Herod. Now there are lots of Herods. Specifically the first one, also known as Herod the Great or King Herod. So there was one Herod, the first Herod, and is like George Foreman. He named all his sons after him. But the first Herod actually was granted the title of king by Caesar. So that was an official title from Rome. He was called King Herod. None of his sons inherited that title because none of them had the political savvy that their father had. But King Herod. So Herodians were Sadducean priests in consort with Rome. They wanted, again, like I just said, go along to get along. So we want to be part of the political system. We want to be in cahoots with Herod and therefore with Rome. So if you see that phrase in the New Testament or in reading about the New Testament, you'll know who the Herodians are. Sadducean priests, so Hellenized kind of priests. Under that, again, polar opposite, zealots. Who's famous? Who's maybe the only zealot you know? Simon the Zealot. Saul was not a zealot. Zealots were they were Jewish revolutionaries. This didn't have to do with religion. It had to do with politics. So protesters, rioters, terrorists, probably even, to do violence kind of in a guerrilla way, didn't organize to the point that they could really affect any change, but they hated Rome, and they were trying to overthrow Roman rule in the Promised Land. So they refused to pay taxes. That would be another. We got some zealots in America, don't we? Third blank, publicans or tax collectors. So the Romans liked to enlist locals to do the dirty work. And so when you read in the Gospels about a publican, and like in the Old King James, but I think it's translated tax collectors in your ESV if you use that like I do. But they were Jews who were considered traitors because they worked for the Roman government. They made all their money by cheating the taxpayer. Matthew, the author of the gospel, Zacchaeus, he was a publican, he was a tax collector. These guys were, especially by the zealots, hated. They were detested because not only did they work for Rome, but they lived off of the backs of their fellow Jews. I might add another thing here. If you know anything about the Roman Empire, perhaps you know that Romans were famous for their roads. All roads lead to Rome. That's that saying. It's because the Romans built roads in a way that had never happened before, which again, like the Greek language, is part of what sets up our New Testament for missions and world evangelism. Okay? So the Roman road system is, I think, significant in the providence of God as well. And so that would cap off the 400 silent years. Now, I'm done extremely early, but I will, if you have any questions, any follow-up from anything that we've talked about or curiosity, go ahead. I don't think there would have been a significant difference in the way they were treated as opposed to other conquests. I don't think they were singled out in a negative or a positive way. That's somewhat supposition, but I think that's an informed supposition. Okay? When you get to under the Roman Empire, there was a freedom of religion, which under Rome, Judaism was protected as a religion, and that's one of the reasons when you read through the book of Acts, for a while Christianity was considered just a sect of Judaism, and so as such it was protected. And one of the goals of the Jews was to separate. So when they're taking Paul, no, he is not a Jew. We want him dead, which eventually happened under. That's why the Christians were persecuted under Nero and following. But yeah, so it's fair. But I don't think other than that, not because they were Jews, I don't think they were treated badly. Any other questions? I'm not going to just hold you up. I'll let you have a longer break in between services, but I'm happy to entertain if you have any other things. Yeah, Emma? I couldn't hear you. Medo-Persian, Medo hyphen Persian. You can read it, like they talk about, I think like a Bible quote would be the law of the Medes, which is Medes, law of the Medes and Persians, which was unbreakable. Like that was when Daniel was thrown into the lion's den. That was under the Medo-Persian, under Cyrus. And because he had signed the law, he couldn't backtrack. So by the law of the Medes and Persians. And that's historically verifiable. That's not just biblical. Yeah. All of his power was mostly a title. So he asked about Herod, back to King Herod. All of his power would have been definitely in subservience to Rome. He couldn't do anything. They could yank the title just as easily as they gave it. So yeah. Okay? Yeah. Yes. Hanukkah came. Yes, that's a good point. Right. The siege. Petra. If you're familiar with Petra, that's Maccabean history, right? Okay, I'll tell you what. I'm gonna let you go, and I'm happy to have individual conversations. If you have follow-ups on any of these matters, let's talk. But I'll dismiss the class so you guys can get ready for the next service. Okay.